Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hey, Kristin, how are you?
Hey, Mark, I am so good. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I think you're located down in LA?
I live in Long Beach, California. Yeah.
Long Beach. That sounds nice. Sounds like you're close to a beach. How's the weather down there? I mean, the whole country's going through a heat wave. How's it in Long Beach?
Yes. Our heat wave typically comes in end of August, beginning of September, October. So right when everyone gets to start putting their fall clothes on is like the worst time of year for us. But yeah, generally speaking, I would say the weather has been getting warmer everywhere. And it's kind of unfortunate because, they used to not have air conditionings in houses out here. And now you almost can't survive without one. Is that how it is up there?
Yeah, no. So funny you say that because I grew up in this area up in the Pacific Northwest and nobody had an aircon growing up, air conditioning. And it's so funny now because like Costco sells them in bulk, Some people get like the full, they call them swamp coolers or whatever. Other people like us, we just got a portable one that we roll out for about 1 or 2 weeks every summer because it gets really hot and it's hard for me to sleep. But I feel like, wow, either the weather has gotten warmer or we've got weaker in terms of, we just need all the creature comforts, but maybe it's a combination of both.
It's probably both.
Yeah. Hey, I'm looking forward to talking with you because I personally have spent many years and a lot of efforts in sales and sales training, sales consulting. And, and you've done a lot of work in that area. You've also written a couple of books about selling. And I want to talk to you about your books because both of them are interesting to me. Be a Better Sales Leader and then Bold Moves Mastery. So I want to talk to you about those. But before we do that, maybe could you talk a little bit about, when did you decide and why did you decide to move from a sales role into more of a sales leadership and then consulting and training role?
Yeah, great question. And thank you again for having me. I don't know if you know a lot, but and depending on who's listening. So I just happened to fall into the industry in 2005. I needed a job. I was selling credit cards at Saks Fifth Avenue on Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. And SDL, I had submitted my resume to them like all over Monster and Career Builder. And anyway, I fell in love with using my brain in a way to understand this new industry because I knew nothing about it. I didn't go to school for it. I'm not bilingual, right? Like a lot of people. And so I just had really great mentorship from the very beginning. And so many people in 2005, which was right after the Trados acquisition of now RWS, but SDL, everybody was there. Nick McMahon, Allison McDougall, Kathleen Bostic, like really big names. And have continued in the industry and gone a lot of places. So I had really great mentorship and I got promoted to lead a team of inside sales reps in the UK. And I'll never forget it. Like 25 years old, I'm flying to the UK 4 times a year. And my parents are like, what do you do? And I was leading this team and writing processes and helping them use the CRM better and hunt leads because I had picked up the skill very fast and seen success with it. And not only that, it's interesting to note that sales team at SDL, they were already targeting big logos and big programs. And so I was truly trained to be like an enterprise level rep, not transactional. And it just that's the start of my industry career. But then also my parents are entrepreneurs and my grandfather owned a company. And so I think it was always innate in me. But I was always wondering, like, how else can I help the business and how can I contribute more? And that is partially why I started to have desires to climb the ladder.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting though, from what I'm hearing you say is that, you came into the industry around 2005, 2006. You worked with these very experienced people. You mentioned Kathleen and Allison and Brendan and others. And so you benefited from their knowledge. And then you also benefited from being put into a leadership role by managing that team in the UK. I'm curious what you think. Are there, first off, when it comes to salespeople, what are some of the key traits that that successful salespeople need to have?
Oh man. Like, it's interesting, right? I think we need to be persistent,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to be passionate about something, maybe the service or the product that we're selling, but like we need to be excited to show up every day, because to be persistent is one thing, but to be told no and to be hung up on and to not have emails responded to, and to be able to evolve with the way, prospecting has gone in the last 20 years, you really have to be passionate about wanting to be there. And so those were like the two biggest attributes: persistence and passion.
I totally would agree with you that those are incredibly important. And I'm going to come back to you on the prospecting thing. And because that, for me, from where I sit, has really evolved in the last few years. And it's become almost like a quote unquote marketing activity versus a sales driven activity. But we'll come back to that. If you think about the key traits for successful salespeople, what are some of the traits then that are needed that might be different for successful sales leaders? Because this is going to kind of dovetail into your book, Be a Better Sales Leader. What are the differences?
Yeah. Well, it's also, so like at SDL in 2005, my boss, when I got promoted, Clive Thomas, he would have me do sit downs with Mark Lancaster. Mm-hmm. Which is crazy. So I got high level CEO exposure at a very young stage in my career. And that is what helped formulate my opinion of how sales leaders really have an influence. So on the one hand, I'm a culture leader. I believe you need to get all of your salespeople in the same boat, rowing in the same direction, because you're often going to have salespeople who are like, I don't use the CRM, and yet they're the most successful salesperson. So you're like, well, at what point do I let that slide? Right. And unfortunately, we've seen it all. We've seen salespeople who make things up in the CRM and so ultimately the reason you need everyone in the boat rowing in the same direction is because the other half of your job as a sales leader is reporting up, is like managing data to your boss or your leaders. And how you do that is, well, I mean, like I have a whole section in the book on managing your manager, but it's also, I think it's so important to visually tell a story that is compelling to the leaders, even if at one quarter or another you're not having success. Because
let's go back before we get to the leaders. I'm curious now because like I've been in that situation where you have superstar salespeople and they're like, man, yeah, I know we're supposed to do the CRM, but I'm pretty busy managing and it's real that they've got this big book of business that they're managing and you don't want to get in their way. So how do you get them, how do you affect that culture change or get everybody rowing in the right direction?
Yeah. Well, we're humans at the end of the day. And so I think it's like meeting people where they are and figuring out what motivates them, what demotivates them. And it's not a one size fits all solution, right? Depending on how big I don't want to name him, but like somebody I used to work with a lot at Lionbridge and who then went on to be CRO somewhere else in the industry. Like he is one of those people who he just hated the CRM, but would flood his pipeline with real $1 million programs that closed. Right. And I don't know. I wasn't managing him. He was my peer. But I think about him a lot in terms of like, what did our manager do to navigate? And there's certain things then at one point, it's like, what is the company's expectations too? Because I've seen CEOs be so granularly involved in the CRM data to like a fault. And then I've been at a company like Lionbridge where I don't think Rory Cowan at the time even knew what CRM we were using, or he didn't care. It was really, the onus was on the leader. So is the leader confident enough in what their outlier is doing And are they producing the right results that like, does it matter or not? Like it really is that question. But when you're selling transactionally, like a lot of companies are smaller programs, $10,000 here, $1,000 there. It's really where I would emphasize the CRM matters more because, you know, a lot adds up. Like 10,000 deals add up. But if you're not tracking any of those deals, it's very easy to say like, well, what have you done for me lately?
Sure. So what I'm hearing you saying is, you know, you need to find a balance between, you know, using the CRM and then or ignoring it. But then the reason you would use it is maybe, let me back up and say, you need to demonstrate to your team the importance of using it, but maybe not make them put in, you know, all kinds of crazy amounts of information. Just put in what's relevant. And then if you can explain to them how this helps the company, how this will help them, then they become, okay, I get it now. But I've been in situations where the CRM usage guidelines were driven by somebody outside of the sales team, and they wanted all this superfluous information that at the end of the day, nobody would really look at. And it was just a time drain on all of the sales teams. So you got to find that balance, right? That's what you're saying?
Right. Because I've also, now that I've consulted and just been exposed to so many more companies, some companies use the CRM for commissions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like that is a motivator, obviously, to clean up your deals and your contacts and everything. But that was never the case in the first 10 years of my career at the bigger companies. They, at that time, were not using it that way. And so it really depends administratively how the CRM is integrated or not to the back end. And then what really is meaningful versus not. I've also been at companies where 20,000 outreach a month was expected. And I've been at companies where
20,000 what?
Like email, like a combination of emails, tasks, calls.
Wow. That's a big number.
Per rep.
Wow.
Like we created things called the kitchen sink campaign and just tried to like figure out how you like throw it all in the kitchen sink, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I've been at companies where like 6 years I spent at Lionbridge as a contributor, and they never once questioned my outreach. It was it was quality over quantity. And so that kind of, and that guy who was at Lionbridge, like obviously his deals were in the CRM. So then it's kind of like.
Yeah, I've seen companies that would say, for example, if you want your commission, you definitely need to be updating your customer information in the CRM. And or like if you want to, because a lot of times everybody wants to handle those key accounts, and maybe you have an account that's not active, but is going to be active. And if you're not updating the information, another account executive could claim that account because say, hey, you know, this account information hasn't been updated for over a year. So either the rep is not, you know, doing their job in terms of interacting with the customer, or they're forgetting to update the CRM. But either way, they lose the right to it. And if somebody else wants to go in and take it over. So that I've seen, you know, different kind of policies around that. Before we get on the subject of like reporting up, because you were starting to talk about what other things do you talk about in your book in terms of developing your team or managing a team from a leadership position?
Yeah, I there's a whole section on why mentors or executive sponsors, like people to help you get better at your job, and then also just professional development. So like it's a two-pronged approach. I was so lucky in my first 10 years, I was naturally exposed to conferences and the ability to go as a, you know, to work the booth. Right. And then, so that's like professional development because you're learning other skills and then you're watching how other people are acting and interacting with prospects, et cetera. And then also women in localization was something that my Lionbridge boss was like introduced me to way back before they were an official nonprofit. And so that is something like, now there's Loc lunches and there's Loc talks and there's so many other opportunities depending on the industry, right? But like, how do you get involved both in your own industry and then also as a salesperson, are you calling a specific vertical? Like, I love that alignment to like vertical, because you can become a subject matter expert within that vertical. And so then so I was a market research vertical queen at Lionbridge for a long time, for 3 years. And so I would go to market research conferences, and then I could like talk the talk, right? And Robin Ayoub, who's like super famous in the industry as well, he had that same experience. He knows this. I'll never forget, I went to a conference with him and he ran circles around me without even trying. Like, he knew every single person's name. He knew exactly everything about their family and like their personal lives too. And it's so important to be given opportunities like that for professional development, because it makes you, the contributor or the leader, better at executing and better at building relationships. And so often it's not a one call close. It's like, we have to see our clients at this conference, at that conference. And so we have to actually be at those conferences in order to build those real relationships, because people buy from people they know, like, and trust.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I totally agree that, especially in our industry, it's a services industry and somewhat commoditized, that if you pick a specific vertical or industry and become a subject matter expert, really understand that industry's requirements, whether it's related to security, quality, workflows, document types, etc. And then you can go in and ask really smart questions, demonstrate your expertise. It helps position you, and then it helps you to kind of build trust in that industry. And on Robin, Robin and I worked together because I was at CLS Communication when we acquired Lexitech. Yeah. And then that became CLS Lexitech, and then it became CLS Communication. That became Lionbridge. So that's funny. Yeah. No, great guy. So let's go back to your earlier point of, from a sales leader, you need to help, develop your team. You need to help, you said, kind of build the appropriate culture or develop that. But you also need to be able to report up in an appropriate or effective manner. What does that mean? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. And again, so for me, I figured out finally my junior year of college that it was more about who the professor was teaching the class and what their expectations were than what I thought in general about the subject matter or how I was going to pass the course. I don't know if that's so obvious to everybody else, but like, once I cracked that code, I got all A's. My senior college, I got all A's. And the first half of my college, I got like B's, C's, and a couple D's because I didn't get it. And I've taken that same thought and applied it at work. So it's, who is my CEO and what do they actually care about? Are they reporting to a board? Are we public? Are we private? Right? And what are the metrics that they are managing? That is how you like reverse engineer managing your manager. It's not, it is coming to the table with innovation. It is coming to the table with new ideas, just like in a QBR, right? You're going to report on the data that's meaningful to the client. And then you're going to use the time or your one-to-ones to suggest things that are new and innovative. And so it's a combination of that, but it's not.
So how do you do that though? I mean, because I can go in and say, well, I think this is what they need. Or, I mean, what's your process to figure that out?
I had a motto that's like, always ask one more question. And so I think it's so simple as you ask, like, are you a current leader? Have you ever had this conversation with your leader? Are you new to an organization leading? Like, where are you? And then just ask, like, flat out.
So, okay, let's role play a little bit here. I'm your supervisor, something like that, and this is our first kind of couple meetings, and you're trying to figure out. You're doing this trick that you learned back in your junior year of university. I got to figure out what this person wants, and I need to be able to speak their language. I need to give them what they want in a manner that they can understand. So, how do you do that?
Yeah. So I'd say, like, Mark, like, what metrics are meaningful to you for revenue growth and for the next year and 5 years of the company? And I might say something like, well, I'd like to see, obviously, how much new business we're closing every month. What is our churn rate with existing clients?
and then what we have in the pipeline. And I might turn it back to you. And this role play is just going to keep going here for a bit. But like if I turn it back to you and I say, Kristin, I want to understand what's in our pipeline, and I don't want some just made up fluff numbers. What's the best way for us to kind of measure what's in the pipeline?
Right. And so I'm assuming I'm assuming I'm new, because this went another way.
Yeah.
Right. So then it's still asking like, who's on the team, or have I gotten a handle of like all 5 or 10 people on the team? And are there any outliers who are not using the CRM the same way? Is there a playbook for how deals should be entered and then follow through the life cycle? And so I am very much like a firm believer in being a no fluff leader, because it doesn't serve you at the end of the day. So it's much more relevant to provide accurate data. The problem is, especially in government, what I've seen a lot is reps will say, oh, this is $1 million deal. But when you actually look at the RFP, it's $1 million over
5 years. Or 2 years. Yeah.
Divided by X number of companies, right? And so that is something that you learn by doing sales and then leading, that you have to come in and course correct. Like and the rep is often happy to course correct it, because they didn't think that, oh my gosh, this isn't $1 million deal. It's actually like 50,000, and that's still great. And so that is something that once I understood from you that this was something that you were lacking from before, I can go in and fix. But I have to fix it by having conversations with the reps and then making sure everyone's following the same process. There doesn't have to be like a robust playbook, because playbooks evolve. Like the concept of how we're tracking or why we're tracking changes. And it's just
it makes a lot of sense. And I want to ask you a couple more questions on the sales leadership topic. And then I want to jump to the other book I see behind you, Say Yes and Figure It Out, because that has me kind of intrigued. But let me ask you this. You're managing a team, right? And you got somebody, let's just say, okay, first off, what's your recruiting process to figuring out, is this person going to be a good fit for the team?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a good question. Well, first of all, what is the team, right? And also like, what is meaningful to the business really, in terms of like what type of culture already exists. But in terms of just blanket like salesperson, I do think that the industry needs more people outside the industry continuously coming in, because otherwise, as you know, we're churning the same people from company to company. That's why I worked at like 8 different companies in my tenure. And so I would advise, and I know there's really great recruiters out there who do the same, to like find people outside of the industry. But like coachability and resourcefulness are 2 of like the biggest attributes I would advise looking for.
And how do you spot those attributes? How do you kind of evaluate them when you're talking with the person or when you're looking at their CV?
Well, looking at the CV is one thing, but like having conversations is another. I mean, I was taught at a young age as a salesperson, to include numbers in my CV, right? Like percentage closed, like actual numbers. And I don't know how the big recruiters like go through so many resumes at once, but as a hiring manager, I'm looking for things like that in their resume.
Sure.
I loved this concept. I came into SDL as an inside salesperson, and that role doesn't really exist in our industry now. We call them BDRs, but often BDRs are offshored. So I love every company I've worked at or have consulted will know that my number one ninja play is to go back to the inside sales days and to find a junior, like maybe by age, maybe by experience, rep like me, right? Who was super coachable. Like I was just dying to have a job that was outside Saks Fifth Avenue. So find that person who wants to, they will express that need to you. You don't have to worry about that. But then find that person who you can mold and groom, and then create what I call a bench, because people love to know that there's growth opportunity within. And so often at bigger LSPs, when I was there, I won't name which ones, they were constantly hiring new senior leaders from outside the organization. And they would come in and like totally changed things up for like, not for better, not for better.
Right.
Always like this, you know.
Yeah, it's kind of demoralizing when, you know, you're looking for that promotion and there's an opportunity, and then they bring in somebody from outside the organization, and it takes them a while to get their sea legs and understand and then they've got their great idea. Hey, we're going to change everything. And maybe they don't need to change everything. Maybe they need to just change a few things, but it can be demoralizing. So what I heard you say is, you know, you're looking for that coachability, that drive, that resourcefulness. And if you can find that, if you can identify that, those are some key attributes of successful salespeople. And that's a good place to start building your team. What happens, when you hire somebody? Cause, you know, some people don't make it. And how do you identify, hey, this person is not going to make it? And how do you have that conversation with them to kind of either put them on a plan or let them know that maybe it's not a good fit? Or, you know, how does that work?
Yeah, those are always the most challenging, right? It's very disheartening, of course, but it is business. And I would say that the CRM in that case doesn't lie, but also your interactions with them. I was always doing weekly group meetings, like a weekly team call, and then a one-to-one weekly. So I would meet with individuals twice a week, one-to-one, and then as a group. And then are they asking me questions, or are they involving me in deals? And it's not always a me thing, depending on the size of the organization. There's engineers and SAs and all types of people to reach out to, right? But am I seeing peripherally that they're working? It is unfortunate for the people not working, because you can straight up tell if people are working or not working. And depending if you're hunting $1 million contracts, that work looks one way. If you're hunting, which most LSPs are, more transactional business, 100K and below, it's much harder to hide, because again, the deals are so much smaller and you need so many more of them to create momentum. And so I personally didn't like to micromanage, because I didn't like to be micromanaged, but that's why the team meetings and then the one-to-ones weekly helped steer the ship. And then I was always meeting with my leader, maybe biweekly or monthly, to understand what the business needs, how the business needs were changing, and would try to course correct anything at the ground level. But then once you identify somebody's not working, it really is just, you need to have an adult conversation and ask them, are they happy? Are there any problems that you're not aware of? And also, like, what is it going to take to get them from where they are today to producing better results?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to handle it. I've been in situations where I moved into a role, and some of the underperforming salespeople, they were kind of the wily veteran underperformers. And there was 3 of them in this one organization in different countries, but I kind of got the same story from each of them, that I've got this mega deal and we're just literally months away from closing, and it's going to be the biggest deal ever, right? And I would say, that is awesome. Let's go meet with the customer or the prospect, and just so that I want to hear directly from them what they're looking for, so we can prepare as an organization. Because if the deal is going to be that big, we're going to need a lot of operational preparation. And that's when I found out, when you found out that the customer or the prospect was saying one thing and the salesperson was interpreting it a little bit differently, or translating it back a little bit different message. And so I would advise any sales leader, get out there and see the customers with them as well. Because 1, you can see their skills and see how are they representing your organization in a professional manner. But 2, you get a real picture of what the market is and what the opportunities are.
Yeah. I love it. I don't know if it's happening much now, right? I know people are still going to conferences, but with like COVID and the pandemic and everything that happened, but like, yeah, ever since my TransPerfect days, and then Lionbridge, especially, because again, my first 10 years was spent at SDL, TransPerfect, and Lionbridge. But at
that's a pretty good place to start in this business. You started at the top 3, basically. That's impressive.
Yeah. And so TransPerfect, I was my own rep versus being a inside sales or a leader of inside sales. And so I started traveling at TransPerfect with myself and or with my boss. And then also at Lionbridge, we traveled a ton. And then I just think that pandemic changed everything. but then it is so important to get out there no matter what, because people are still available for lunch and you can still try to figure out like one of the best ninja moves I have is where are they going to be already? Like, again, like what conferences are they going to, or what type of things are they contributing to? And that you can be there with them. But
Yeah.
I agree, the bigger the deals, the harder it is. Well, it's a different way of hiding because you can't have, and we see this all the time, one deal in your pipeline. And
Right.
it to be the deal that carries you home. Like,
Actually, that's a really good point. If they say like, if they got this big deal, you say, okay, but what else do you got? Right. You know, this is awesome. No, that's a really good point as well. And my number one rule, I've got a bunch of number one rules, but one of my number one rules is always get the meeting. No matter what, get the meeting, because that's when the real business starts to take place. But you're right, because after COVID, so many people are doing this, the virtual stuff, and it's kind of a substitute. But I still think, like to your point, if you can meet the people face to face, have lunch with them, have a cup of coffee, that's where the real trust in relationships starts to build in most cases. Let me ask you one more question on this topic. Do you have a favorite sales story from you or one of your teammates in terms of their prospecting to closing like a really nice deal?
I have so many sales stories.
Okay, let's hear one. Come on, just give us one.
Well, honestly, one of my favorite sales, it wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal because this client is known to not work with anyone else except for the one person he works with. And they spend millions and millions of dollars on translation. And I lost the deal at translations. When I was at TDC, I lost the RFP. Okay. They used to work with Iverson, who TPT acquired. And that was the same year of an RFP. And I came in representing Iverson, i.e. TransPerfect. And we lost to Sagen. And a few years later, I see this, like several years later, I see this guy at Taos. Right. So again, like this is like, because this is me preaching what I've just said. So I go to Taos, which is a really big event, very small, but big, important event. Right. And I'm like, hey, I'll never forget. And I know he won't either. I like tackle him in the hallway. A few people there. And I'm just like, hi, do you remember me? And we weren't even connected on LinkedIn because this is how things have evolved. And so I connected with him on LinkedIn. And then I use this strategy to cold sell anything in the DMs now. And it's, it can be used across verticals or industries. And so a couple years after that, we go through this DM often. A couple years after that, I saw him looking at my profile, and that's just, we're so scared to reach out, right? Because it's like, oh, it's a little creepy. And I just said, hey, are you open to a call about localization outcomes? Because he's a big enough buyer that I knew he would know what I meant. And again, he doesn't work with anybody. And he said, yeah, always open. And so we got on a meeting and I did typical discovery. And at the time I was already leading. And so I did something which I always called separate church and state, because at that time I wasn't a player coach. I was just a coach, right? I didn't have that. And so I very delicately, identified two potential opportunities in that 1 30-minute call. And I said, I'm going to bring in my sales rep to help kind of carry this through. And then I had a framework that I've talked about a lot, that I drive clients down a path. And basically that concept is similar to yours, which is never leave a meeting without having the next meeting, right? And at the end of all of it, he ultimately gave us business and we started doing a ton of pilots for him and. So it's not like the biggest, it's not I ultimately left. But I also don't know. There's so many opportunities where, okay, so that's one story. I had another client who spent like 2
No, but I think the important thing with my takeaway on that story is never say never give up. And you got to keep good relations with people because, you might be doing business with them today. Tomorrow, they might go someplace else. They might change companies and then they might bring you business there, right? I mean, it's really important to keep good relations and connections with people that you've worked with or hope to work with, because you never know. Things can come back to you, right?
And people remember, right?
Yeah.
So like, whether I freaked him out in that whole hotel hallway.
Well, you made an impression. That was good. Hey, so let's talk about say yes and figure it out. What's that about?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I'm known as like just the girl who gets things done. I'm known as the LFG queen, which we have recoined to say laser focused growth. But so often talking to industry people, entrepreneurs, whoever, it's like the number one thing standing in our way of doing sales or is like inaction, is like not taking action, knowing I have to make 100 phone calls today or send 20 outreach, whatever it is, or 20,000, but like then not taking one step. And so I created this idea. Well, I just started, one of my mentors said, how do you do it? Everybody just is looking at you like, how are you doing it? And so I figured out that it was 4 simple steps. And the first step of say yes and figure it out is, or the first step of my framework is like, decide. So as a salesperson, decide today that you're going to do 20 outreach or 100 phone calls. Just decide. And then the next step is to take a step. So it's one thing to decide it. And then it's another thing to productively procrastinate and be like, well, I really was going to do it, but I had this other thing, i.e. an RFP to respond to that was super important, right?
Yeah.
Actually take a step toward doing it. And then the third step is lean in. And so you don't have to do things alone, and you lean into your colleagues, lean into your leader. Your leader would love for you to ask them, to have you ask them a question, because that's going to trigger to your leader that you're working, right? So like lean in. And then the fourth step is to celebrate. And anyone who's ever reported to me or been consulted by me, they know that like celebrate everything, including the smallest things. Like that's how you create this culture on Teams or Slack in this virtual world, where it's like, I just had so-and-so respond to my cold DM on LinkedIn. Like, who knows what's going to happen next? We now know the outcome, but like celebrate that, create a culture that you're rewarding people, you're celebrating people that really are looking at the smallest wins throughout their day, because movement builds momentum. And so, yeah.
No, I love that. I'm going to start from the back and then go back to towards the end and go back to the beginning. But I'm a firm believer in activity targets on things that you can control. There's not a lot that you can control. You can't control the macroeconomic situation. You can't control your prospects, their market situation, their financial situations. You can't control the competition, but you can control how many times you pick up the phone or how many messages you send, how many people that you introduce yourself to at an event. And if you have targets defined for those and you take action, and you hit your targets, it doesn't matter if you didn't close a deal or not. Pat yourself on the back and say, I did my job. I did the things that I can control. And if you do them long enough and you do them well enough, you'll get success. But if you're worried about, I didn't close a deal, well, you can't control that exactly. So I'm a firm believer in that. And then earlier you said, so procrastination, I think it's a life killer, man. I mean, because there's so many things that we want to do in life that people just put off, and they're like, well, I'm just going to do a little bit more research, or I'm just going to get a little bit more prepared, or when I get to this. And it's like, no, man, you just got to take that first step. And as soon as you take that first step, a couple things will happen. One, you'll get some momentum, but you'll get feedback and you'll learn from your interaction, whether that's calling, messaging, doing something on social media. Just get it out there, get feedback, learn from it. And what I found is when you start to do things, the world starts to conspire with you. Because if people say, hey, Kristin, man, I mean, she's doing this thing, and maybe it's like writing a book, for example, doing public speaking. All of a sudden, people call and say, "Hey, why don't you come on my podcast, or why don't you come and speak at our event?" Right? I mean, you start to gain momentum, and but it's taking that first step, and we come up with all these reasons why we shouldn't do it now. We want to wait for it, right? Mm-hmm. So, no, I'm totally with you.
It's so true.
So tell me a little bit more about the book. What else is in there?
Yeah, the beginning of the book is really all about these concepts of imposter syndrome and everything that like I have experienced and others have told me they experience as to what stops them from doing A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And then ultimately the subtitle is The Perfect Framework for Taking Massive Imperfect Action. So it's like permission to not have everything figured out in order to start moving forward. And then my favorite part about the book is I have a growing Facebook community where I'm doing say yes interviews, because whether it's a big monumental thing, like I'm the CEO or founder of a company, to I won this client, like we all have macro and micro say yes stories in our life. And so I'm interviewing people and I'm giving them a chance to share their stories, because I really think that this is a movement. If we can inspire other people with our own say yes stories, then that is how we change the world. And we, can
you give me an example of a say yes story?
Well, I think my own say yes story is when I was unexpectedly and unfortunately let go from my job in April 17th, 2023, that I loved and I still have mad respect for. But I turned what happened to me truly into what happened for me by launching my own business that day and never looking back. And so we hear everything like that from, I have a story in the community of somebody who met his now wife on Match. I think it was like a social media platform, and she was blind and she was interacting with him. So I don't know actually the tactics and the specifics. I mean, they're married now. He's fully eye seeing and she's blind, and they have this like incredible story about how, I mean, she can talk, she can do all the things. And obviously she could figure out how to read or have somebody help her. And they developed this relationship at first, and then around God too. And then now they're, married for over 5 years. And it's just an incredible story because he said yes to a phone call when he was telling me, he's like, I didn't even realize it said at the top of her headline was something like, your best blind date ever. Because
oh, that's funny. She's got a sense of humor. That's amazing. That's
yeah. Wow. And so it runs the gamut, right? The say yes story.
Awesome. Well, let me ask you just a couple more questions. Being in your type of role, I think it's really important to kind of continually be learning. And so where do you go to learn new things about selling or time management or, personal development? How do you do that?
Oh, great question. I love being around other people who are 1, 2, 10 steps ahead of me. And so I invest a lot of money and a lot of time in mentorship. So there's several different types of mentorships. There's mentors that you meet in your career. Maybe they're your CEO and you're a rep and they're willing to mentor you because they see potential in you. Or maybe it's a former somebody or another, or somebody in the industry. Maybe you're in the Women in Localization mentorship program. But then there is mentors that can coach you to improving your business. And for me, not having a real marketing background, like, I'm going to actually touch on that, but like sales kind of is marketing now because of the customer journeys changed. The reality is I need help. I know I'm willing to say I need help. And so I go to masterminds and I go to conferences to learn new strategies. And then I come back and I implement them, which then separates me from so many others, because it's not for lack of information out there. It's really lack of taking action and taking that one step.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the world that we're living in right now, there are so many opportunities for learning. I mean, you could look at all the content on LinkedIn, on YouTube. And then, I personal anecdote on my side, I have some sailing experience, but I'm mostly self-taught. I recently started again, and I've surrounded myself with some people who are like, they were on their university sailing teams and they are so far out there. And at my age, it's kind of, it's very, very humbling and a little bit scary to be around people who are so much more skilled and knowledgeable about something. And because I feel like I'm like a little kid, right? But guess what? I'm learning so much, man. It's awesome. And so I just say, it's okay. It's okay to be kind of like the dumbest person in the room, but I just need to be a sponge and soak it all up. And it's humbling, but it does pay off.
Yeah, 100%. Like people pay for proximity, people pay for speed. And that is how you can quantum leap. That is how you can 10x your life where you are right now. That's how you can get promoted, climb the ladder, is like being willing to put your ego aside and be the dumbest person in the room. Yeah.
Put the ego aside. It's huge. I think that's a really important part of selling as well, because you need to be, empathy, and you have to build trust and all that stuff. Last kind of topic I want to touch on is I think whether you're selling or whatever you're working in, energy, your physical, emotional, mental, spiritual energy is hugely important. And I know it dramatically affects my output and my performance and my ambition. And if I am, feeling fresh, eating well, getting enough sleep, staying away from the beer, I can do so much more. And then when I'm kind of run down, if I'm on an extended road trip and I've been doing late night entertaining and all that kind of stuff, it can just go in the opposite direction. So what do you do to stay energized, and not just physically, but also mentally, emotionally?
Yeah. Well, that couldn't agree with you more. And I was going to throw in for you also go sailing, right? Because you
yes. Yes. That is part of the equation. Totally.
Yeah. So for me, and I have young kids. So it's I have a 6-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. So
they've got energy.
Yeah. So it's so important. I'm calling this my 2.0 season of being an entrepreneur. And I'm doing something crazy, which is scaling back my work hours, not even doing 40 hours a week, but 20.
Wow. That's awesome.
And so I've just noticed that, working for other people for my whole life, you can dictate. If you're in the West Coast, you're obviously, well, for most companies, you're not going to be working East Coast hours. So there's that. But you can't control the random 7 a.m. meeting on your calendar to accommodate all the global time zones. And you obviously are still traveling for clients and all these things. And for when I first started being an entrepreneur, I blocked off 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. And working out, I'm not from the West Coast. So it is the rest of the world is like halfway done with their day already. And so that was like a big win for me to just not work 8 to 9. But as my kids are getting older, I've realized that it's still not enough for me because I feel rushed in the morning, and that's not good. We're up at 5 a.m. It's not that. It's just that I'm with my children until like 8 when I'm shoving them out the door to school. And so how do I take back more of my time and prioritize going to the gym at the beginning of my day versus thinking I'm going to slip it in at the end? Because for me,
it's so funny. I do that same thing. I mean, I work out every morning, but once in a while I'll be like, well, I'll do it in the afternoon. And guess what? I would say my success rate on that little promise to myself is like less than 10%. So now I feel better that I'm not the only one that's doing that. So that's good. But please continue.
No. And then that's it. Like, I did figure out this concept of no extra time, which isn't a new concept, and it's controversial. But when I go for a walk, I try to go for a walk every day, also like an hour-long walk. And I listen to professional development at the time, right? And some people say, no, don't do that. Listen to the birds and the bees. But for me, it really helps me double down on everything. And so, it's like the mental gain while you're also just, I say, like, when I was a freshman in high school, you had to run a 7-minute mile to qualify for varsity soccer. And I have a whole story. And ultimately, 4 tries later, I did make it. I made the 7-minute mile. Now I walk like a 17-minute mile. Like I am like a snail out there, but I'm happy. Right?
Well, no, and I do the same thing, and I walk and I listen to books like Tim Ferriss or Tony Robbins or whoever, and I get these ideas, and it's energizing. So I'm glad that you do that as well. We share some similar habits. Let me ask you this, Kristin. So you're scaling back your practice, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the types of companies you work with and how you engage with them and the types of services that you're providing.
One thing I love to do now, and thank you for asking, is come in to do workshops. I find it's very meaningful for the companies. And honestly, because of my sales background, the workshop that seems to land the most, And I have several, like I can teach teams how to create passion projects within their roles. Obviously, we can do workshops on selling, or I can do workshops with leaders around different topics. But the one workshop that people love the most is this concept of seller's mindset, because depending on the size of the company, more often than not, your project managers and other peripheral people to sales are interacting a lot with sales, with their clients. And how do you inspire them to take the right action in those interactions with the client? How do you actually just pause for a minute and say, like, your role matters and it's helping us keep revenue, it's helping us grow revenue? And in part, one of my clients gave me this idea. And also when I worked at Lionbridge, I never saw a PM's job description, but I can't say for certain if it was in there or not, but those project managers, the lowest level project managers, were so client facing. They were so good at email. They were so good at things that I noticed as a consultant, mid-sized, smaller LSPs, it's just not ingrained in their project manager culture. So long story short, that's one thing I love to do.
No, so those are some amazing services, and I'm sure they're highly in demand because everybody wants to grow their business and sell more. And then on the topic of project management is so funny because I think that the business development person is really important to win new business and kind of manage that relationship, do the QBRs. But I've found more often than not that critical person is the project manager. And I've had so many customers to be like, please don't let our project manager leave, because once they have that trusting relationship with them, that's the kind of cement that bonds the relationship. But well, hey, Kristin, I'm going to put links to your books in the show notes. If anybody wants to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Good question, Mark. Yeah, they can DM me on LinkedIn. That's super easy.
Awesome. And I'll see if I can put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes as well.
Yeah, even hello@beabettersalesleader.com. And they can end up in any of my funnels and I will see them. Like when you put sayyesanfigureitout.com, for some reason I love long URLs, but they also just roll off your tongue. So I own beabettersalesleader.com and now I own sayyesanfigureitout.com. But
that's awesome. Well, hey, Kristin, really enjoyed the conversation. I'm feeling energized now and look forward to meeting you at hopefully one of the industry events coming up in the fall.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.